Hello. Welcome to the Virtual Figgy Art Museum. My name is Joshua Johnson. I am the Assistant Registrar at the museum and had the privilege of acting as the curator of the George Olson the Found Object exhibition. Today we're going to be lucky enough to hear a recorded interview with George where he will walk us through some of the various techniques that he used in his artworks, as well as his kind of artistic process and his thought behind some of the individual works in the exhibition. Please enjoy the interview and click on other links on our website and our Facebook pages for more interviews like this. George, one of the things I wanted to ask you was, why do you think you were drawn towards making art as a profession?
Well, when I was a small child, I had three older siblings who were quite artistic. And it was what we did to entertain ourselves when I was very small. In fact, I assumed that everybody was born with a lot of talent because I was surrounded by it. And I was sort of amazed when I eventually went off to school and was surrounded by small children who were not very talented. I'm sure some of my comments were not very polite at that time. But then later I got more serious about using art for a means of understanding things and becoming much more serious about the creative side of it. But the point is, it started very young. I don't remember ever being without art as an activity.
Many people in the Quad City area will be kind of familiar with your kind of artistic background, but can you talk a little bit about what your training was and like where you went to school and that sort of thing?
Yes, I went to high school up in Minnesota and then came all the way down to Augustana College across the river from the Figgy. Although I didn't take a whole lot of art at Augustana, that had to wait until I got to the University of Iowa, and which has still has a very strong art department. And then I went off to teach out in Ohio at the College of Worcester for about almost 40 years. And the College of Worcester was very supportive of their faculty, regardless of what area you were in. So I got a lot of encouragement being in the art field and quite a bit of time off in the form of sabbaticals to get on with it.
You've had a long artistic career, and you've in that time explored a lot of different mediums, many of which are represented in the present exhibition at the Figgy. But one that you seem to keep coming back to is watercolor. Why, with all these other mediums that you've explored, do you keep returning to watercolor, do you think?
Well, I don't know if I would refer to it as returning to watercolor. That came a little later in my career. I started out doing oil paintings right out of graduate school, and I kept that up for several years. I had a big exhibition in Chicago around 1970, and I had been working so hard on that I felt that I needed a break after the exhibition, so I took up the woodcut, which had never been taught at the University of Iowa, and the woodcut eventually led me to doing relief prints. All the while I kept doing drawings in charcoal and pencil and pen and ink and so forth. And then the watercolors came a little bit later in the 70s and 80s, just because that seemed to be the best medium for doing botanical studies like prairie plants and seed pods and that sort of subject. But there was never a very clean break between all of these media. I kept doing quite a few of them simultaneously, and still do.
Now, what do you see as the relationship between, the botanical studies and this kind of earlier body of work and the relief prints?
Well, although the relief printing and painting in oil would seem to be radically different from relief printing or from botanical work. The processes have much in common. I think the key words here would be design and composition and structure. Some botanical forms, especially the ones that are dead and dried, resemble mechanical forms more than one would think. And the artist can sometimes benefit, or at least I have benefited by noticing some of these similarities during the creative process. And the design process is always important, whether you're arranging leaves and stalks on watercolor paper, or if you're arranging scrap metal or pieces of wood on a plywood base. That's putting it rather crudely, but I think all of the media have come back to some things that they have in common.
You're considering similar things regardless of whether you're working in abstraction or more representationally. It's still kind of form and line and value and all those other considerations, but also, just making a good image regardless of it's abstract or representational, I imagine. Would you agree with that?
Mm-hmm. Precisely.
So you talked about that there's, even in the botanical drawings, there's reference to almost mechanical parts and things like that. So, that's a good transition to my next question, which is, what does the term found object mean to you?
Well, found object can be interpreted pretty narrowly. There are good examples in the art world with people like Marcel Duchamp with his bottle rack and his urinal. These were objects without any additions or changes. They simply were put on exhibition as they were. Artists like Picasso would turn found objects into sculpture. He did a baboon's head made from a toy car with headlights for eyes. Everybody is probably familiar with that. And he also made a rather interesting bull's head made from a bicycle seat and a pair of handlebars. Any artist who makes a collage, for example, is working with found objects, old tickets and menus and programs and sandpaper and bits of cardboard, anything that fits the collage. And of course, found object can also be interpreted rather broadly to include any subject that is found by a painter or a photographer or even a poet or a songwriter. These would include old barns and bridges and farm implements and old oaken buckets and rain barrels and so forth. What the relief printer is doing is simply selecting a flat object or a tangible piece of an object and inking it up in order to make an image or a composition.
Right. So why do you think you personally were drawn to exploring the found object?
Well, a lot of found objects are interesting because of their unusual shapes or the relationship of the parts, and certainly the quality of the materials used. Some poets have discovered this. Richard Wilbur, the American poet, wrote a poem called Junk, in which he compares the sturdy and more durable items in a junkyard with the rather flimsy plastic items that are brand new still on the shelf. In my own early oil paintings, I included some littered up landscapes, and this led gradually to an interest in the objects themselves, including some that were just asking to be printed like a woodcut, and that's what led to the relief printing.
Can you explain the process of the open block relief printing for us?
Yes, the process for a relief print is very much like the process for a woodcut. with which most people are familiar, except that you're assembling the block out of small pieces of metal and scrap metal and iron and wood, instead of printing a simple or a single carved image. When I work with students, I usually have them start by, first of all, finding the objects. We need the found objects, and then fastening 2 or 3 small pieces of wood or scrap metal onto a wooden plywood base. After printing a proof of this composition, then decisions can be made about adding more pieces or making some changes to complete the design. When the first block is complete, then additional blocks can be assembled or carved to add some color. Multiple blocks have to be carefully registered in a printing jig or setup, and then they're printed on rice paper using the palm of the hand for pressure. There's no mechanical press involved.
With that, with your use of these, found materials for the printing process, and also, your ink drawings really look like a lot of accumulation of these man-made materials. Was there some kind of, environmental consciousness when you were thinking about this? Were you thinking about this abundance of material that we've kind of created as a species that we sometimes don't seem to know what to do with? Was that a consideration of yours?
Well, if you're referring to the large drawings in the Figge exhibition, they've mystified quite a few viewers over the years, and I wish I had written down some of their wild interpretations. I must confess I myself don't have a very good explanation for every last detail. One or two approaches that sometimes occurred to me just thinking it over. The first one is that the forms are simply a more complex example of my fascination with found objects. I sometimes, when I was doing them early on, I sometimes referred to them as outdoor still life, which is simply an extension of the traditional indoor still life. On a more subtle level, I read in a prairie book that the pioneers who crossed the prairie in their ox carts and their covered wagons sometimes made huge stacks of anything they could find, like buffalo dung or prairie grasses or bushes or cactuses or whatever, just to break the monotony of the flat landscape temporarily and get away from that distant flat horizon line. I'm not sure if that applies to my drawings or not, but it's interesting to think about. And then another possible explanation is that the piled up architectural forms might represent my abandoned career in architecture, which I had contemplated for many years. That's a little private interpretation that probably wouldn't mean much to anybody else. And beyond that, there may be some more interpretations that the viewers will come up with.
Like we've said, you've transitioned through, these found object prints and these ink drawings that deal with this accumulation of found objects to, the botanical works that people are maybe more familiar with now, at least in the Quad City region. What are you working on now? What keeps you kind of coming back to the studio every day?
Well, the thing that brings me back is my continuing interest in everything I've worked on. In fact, I sometimes wish I could go back and repeat all the different stages in my artistic career, but it's not always possible. It requires a different type of studio and everything. But when I was just starting out and continuing after that, the thing that inspired me to get to the studio and get some work done was the overall need to simply see things clearly and understand the structure and the gesture of whatever the subject was, whether it was a tree or a prairie plant or a seed capsule or a found object of some sort. Then there's the therapeutic aspect, that's the word I use carefully, of the creative process, especially when you're under stress or grieving over a loss of some kind. The artistic process can be quite helpful. And this is what documented by other people writing on this topic. And there's a practical aspect which has sometimes entered in, simply getting ready for an exhibition where the work is required, or a publication, or a slide lecture, or something else where you're facing a deadline. And as a child, I remember it was mostly the fascination with the natural world, or with man-made forms, including architecture and bridges and things like that, which you didn't really feel you had captured until you got them down on paper. And there are probably some other sources of inspiration that are much more subtle than that.
Well, George, thank you so much for being willing to talk with us today and kind of give us a little overview of your artistic process and a little insight into the works in the exhibition. We really appreciate it.
That's my pleasure. Thank you.
Well, if you enjoyed listening to that interview, I would very much encourage you to visit the Figgy Facebook page, the Figgy website, and the Figgy YouTube page, which will include more videos like this one that focuses on exhibitions that are currently on view, as well as information about upcoming exhibitions that will be open to the public in the future once we reopen. Thank you very much for joining me at the Virtual Figgy Art Museum today.